All right, so we've seen that there are specifically dependent continuants, qualities on the one hand, functions, roles, dispositions on the other hand. Now we need to introduce generically dependent continuants. Specifically dependent continuants are clear. Your headache is specifically dependent upon you. But we know that there are dependent continuants which can be migrated from one bearer to another. And a good example is an email message. An email message is a certain pattern, which is a quality in BFO terms. It's a pattern of pixels, for instance, and we can send the email message from one screen or from one server to another server or to another screen or to another laptop. And the content of the email, indeed the pattern of the email, migrates from one bearer to another. Another case of the same sort, it occurs when we have a chromosome which is shared, which migrates, as it were, across many, many cells. We have two kinds of generically dependent or copyable dependent continuants. On the one hand, we have information entities, and on the other hand, we have things like nucleic acid sequences. Now, there may be others. It's possible that we think of organizations as being generically dependent in the same way, organizational patterns. But we'll deal with just these two, because these are the two which are most uncontroversial. We have GDCs, which are generically dependent continuants, and SDCs, which are specifically dependent continuants. We have, for instance, a plan specification. So I write a plan, a protocol for a certain kind of assay, which I'm going to perform in a certain lab. The plan specification gets concretized in patterns of ink on my piece of paper where I write down the plan. So the patterns of ink are a quality in BFO terms, which concretize, they make concrete the plan specification, which can be then entered into a computer by means of a keyboard, and then it can exist also as another pattern of slightly less scruffy pixel marks rather than ink marks. So the same plan specification is concretized now in two different places. On the one hand in the piece of paper, and on the other hand in the laptop. And then I email it to 338 people, and now it's concretized 340 times, for the moment at least. Actually, probably more, because it gets concretized by servers all the way along. And then somebody reads it, and then it gets concretized finally in somebody's head. And that somebody may then say, oh, I'm going to perform this assay. And they embrace the plan specification as an actual plan. And then they do the assay in that they realize the plan. So the plan is a realizable dependent continuant which is in somebody's head. The plan gets realized by actions of performing the assay in a lab. Now, similarly, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a pattern, a generically dependent continuant, which we know can be realized in multiple different performances. And it can be concretized in multiple different scores. So this is an instance of the type symphony, which is a subtype of the type musical work, which is concretized in patterns of ink marks borne by scores. The score is like a plan. In fact, it's an instance of the type OB plan specification. And it specifies how to create a performance, just as the protocol of an experiment specifies how to create an investigation, a realization of the plan. The score is realized in the performance. So the score is the plan is realized in the performance, bangs and whistles. And then also for the experimental protocols, so you have a protocol which is an instance of the type plan specification, which is concretized in a plan in the mind of the leader of some team, which this plan is a realizable specifically dependent continuant in that person's head. The realization of the plan involves creating a series of sub-plans because it's a multi-person experiment, which get realized in, which get concretized in the minds or heads of multiple team members. And then the experiment itself is the sum of all the realizations of these sub-plans. And it has outputs which are generically dependent continuants in the form of publications, databases, and so forth. So now we're down to here. We have specifically dependent continuants. We have generically dependent continuants, which are information artifacts and sequences. Functionings are realizations of functions, and things like experiments are realizations of plans, which are dispositions, which are concretized, which are dispositions which are determined by plans, plan specifications, which are concretized, for instance, in patterns on screens, which are read by people who thereby adopt the plan and realize it in certain actions. And now we are getting closer and closer to capturing what is here. So we have all of this here. So we don't have boundaries and temporal regions, and we don't have spatial regions, and we don't have objects and object parts, but we'll come to those next. So now we'll have a pause for questions.
So at some point you corrected yourself from mind to head. It is
I wasn't correcting myself. I was trying to cover all my bases.
Yeah. So what is mind?
That ex officio BFO has no view on that matter. You can choose your own view about mind. We are working on a series of ontologies for neurological, psychological, and psychiatric phenomena. And so far we've managed to do quite a lot of work without having to commit ourselves on views like that. So one goal of this work is to be neutral. One even more important goal is to avoid old with a big O, philosophical with a big P issues that philosophers have been worrying about for centuries.
No, I was just asking that these plans are realized in the head of a person?
The plan exists in the head is the best I can do. So you want breakfast. You wake up, you want breakfast. You have a plan in your head to go and make breakfast.
Physically in my head?
I didn't say physically. I didn't say much more than in. Actually, I think it's spatially in your head. But I don't want to go further than that. Yep.
So why is the plan specification an individual rather than, or so have you considered the possibility that a plan specification could be a universal which is instantiated in?
Yes, so that can't be right. So it's tempting to say that War and Peace, which is a novel written by Tolstoy, is a universal, and all the copies are instances. That means that Tolstoy created a universal, which is made of, I don't know, 470,000 characters. And that doesn't seem right. It would mean also that universals came in different editions, which also doesn't seem right. So I think that information artifacts are instances. So Tolstoy created an instance of the kind novel, and that instance has many concretizations, which are all the copies in the original manuscripts. So we have novel, copy. And the copies are actual books. So that's an instance. This is an actual book. There's an actual book. Or they are PDF files. PDF file number 4307B. That's an instance of the kind copy. And then we have novel. War and Peace is an instance of novel. Now, War and Peace, instance of. War and Peace is not a physical thing. It's neither a book made of paper and ink, nor is it a PDF file made of bytes in somebody's laptop. Rather, it's a creation that can be concretized in many different copies. And there are other novels, so I'm told. The Hound of the Baskervilles is a novel. So there are two novels, and there are many, many, many copies of each of them.
Is a translation, in this case, from Russian to English, a copy?
The translation is a copy of the translation, and it may be that translation of novel is another universal. I don't know. Then that would have many copies. I mean instances, sorry, each of which would have many copies. And there could be different translations of War and Peace, so including into French.
Peace, it's war and world.
War and?
For peace and world is one term in Russian.
Oh, I see, war and world.
Already to translate peace is wrong.
Yeah, we're all used to War and Peace, so it sounds nicer. Now, we in the original BFO 1.0, 1.1, we had two kinds of boundaries, Fiat boundaries and physical boundaries, or bona fide boundaries. In the new 2.0, we have decided only to allow Fiat boundaries. And I will explain what this means now. So this is a boundary here of this table. But if we examine the table at the microscopic level, then we see that actually there is no one surface here, that rather there is a humming, buzzing confusion of microphysical particles. But still, we like to think that there is one tabletop and that we can put things on this one tabletop. And it's very useful for many kinds of data-driven purposes to have one entity, which is the surface of a table, or the surface of somebody's chest through which a surgeon has to make an incision. It's useful to have a word for that. But it's not the physical boundary, it's what we call a Fiat boundary. And I will explain what that means in a minute. So all boundaries in BFO2 are Fiat. This is a list of some boundaries: the anchored anatomical plane, the craniocervical plane, the posterior plane of the oral orifice. I can sort of imagine what that is. The thoraco-abdominal plane. These are lines drawn through the organism to correspond to lines that you might draw in a diagram of the organism. But they don't correspond to any discontinuities in the physics of the organism. They are just convenient lines to draw in order to enable, for instance, the lower gut and the upper gut, or the lower tibia and the upper tibia and the mid tibia, to be distinguished from each other. So an example, it could be the mouth of an organism, but if it's the mouth of a cave, then there is a Fiat boundary separating the cave from the exterior of the cave, and there is a physical boundary separating the cave from the rock on either side. Now, we don't care about the physical boundary. We treat all of these boundaries as Fiat boundaries just for convenience sake. So we have here continuant Fiat boundary, which is an immaterial entity. And we have object, Fiat object part, object aggregate, which are material entities, which means made of molecules, roughly speaking. And this means is not made of molecules, but is still a continuant and is still tied very closely to the associated material entities, because you can't have a Fiat boundary without having some physical thing which it's related to. Now, the cave itself is, in BFO terms, a site. Lisbon is a site. This room is a site. Lisbon is also a mound of buildings. don't want to go into any earthquake history, but by mound I mean an organized collection of buildings and roads and so forth. That is a material entity. But Lisbon, the city in which you can live and move, is a site. So that Lisbon is actually ambiguous from BFO points of view. It refers both to the site where people live and to the collection of buildings and roads and so forth, which people touch and walk on. Now, there are sites which have no physical boundaries of their own because they are created in relation to physical entities, material entities, which are at certain defined geographical distance from those entities. So good examples of these kinds of entities are controlled airspaces. So class A controlled airspace is above 18,000 meters from sea level. It's all Fiat boundary. There is nothing that even looks like a physical boundary here, but it's defined in terms of sea level, which does involve physical boundaries. So I talked about the ambiguity of Lisbon. This is a slide about the ambiguity of Manhattan. We can do this not just for cities and caves, but also for mouths, nostrils, cars, labs, beds, and so on. So there is getting into bed, which is getting into the site that you actually create by getting into the bed. And there is standing on the bed, which is standing on the material entity, which is the bed. Boundaries and sites go hand in hand. Wherever we have a site, we also have boundaries. Now, the boundaries need not be fixed. They could change with time. For instance, when we have a buzzard flying in the sky and it takes its environment, its range with it. Or it could be precise, it could be less precise. The boundary could be a point, for instance, the North Pole, or it could be a line, for instance, the equator, or it could be a surface, for instance, Portugal. Now, there was a debate in the BFO community for a time about why BFO needs both sites and spatial regions. Now, spatial regions we need in order to do physics. So the Earth is moving through space, and at any given point in time, the Earth occupies some specific spatial region. That spatial region can be captured by using some three-dimensional coordinate system, defined in relation to the sun, for instance, as the 0 point. So spatial regions are associated with frames of reference. Spatiotemporal regions are associated with frames of reference. Temporal regions, such as the year 2016, are defined in association with frames of reference. Sites, however, do not reflect any definition. Sites exist because there is a gap in material entities, such as, for instance, the gap created by the walls and roof and floor of this room, which we are presently occupying. And we need terms for sites because we need to talk about the environments of organisms, for instance, or we need to talk about binding sites in proteins. And we need terms for spatial regions because we need to talk about geographic locations. We need terms for temporal regions because we need to talk about calendar dates and so forth. When we talk about surfaces, we're talking about Fiat boundaries, and we don't need to make the assumption that they coincide with any physical discontinuities. There is a connection between boundaries and spatial regions. Every zero-dimensional boundary, for instance, the North Pole, is always at some zero-dimensional spatial region at any given time. And every one-dimensional boundary is always at some one-dimensional spatial region in time. The equator is always somewhere in space at any given time, and so forth. So there is an association here. And then sites are always at some three-dimensional spatial region at some time. So if you take the hull of a ship, which has cargo inside it, that's a site. The ship moves across the Atlantic, so the site moves with the ship. Spatial regions cannot move. Sites can move, and that's why we need both sites and spatial regions in BFO. Now, similarly, material entities can move, and material entities always occupy three-dimensional spatial regions. The Earth is always somewhere, just as the equator is always somewhere. And now we come to time. So just as objects like me have spatial boundaries, so processes have temporal boundaries. A race begins at a certain time and ends at a certain time. Your life begins at a certain time and ends at a certain time. The end of your life, your death, is a process boundary. Process boundaries occupy zero-dimensional temporal regions, just as processes occupy one-dimensional temporal regions. Now, we've mentioned material entities and immaterial entities. Now let's deal with them in more detail. So a site is an immaterial entity, a boundary is an immaterial entity, because they're not made of molecules. There are three kinds of material entities. The first kind is object. Now, an object is something like you or me, or this laptop, or this piece of chalk. And actually, there are three kinds of objects. Me, the laptop, and the chalk. I am an organism. I'm held together by the kinds of forces which hold organisms together. The laptop is held together by screws and glue, and the kinds of forces through which screws and glue work. And the piece of chalk is held together by chemical bonds. They are the three kinds of objects. Maybe somebody will tell me there's a fourth kind of object, which would be great. But for the moment, there are three. I recognize it. Now, in addition, there are Fiat object parts. So if we take this piece of chalk and imagine dividing it in the middle, then we already have two half pieces of chalk. But neither of them is an object. Because an object is defined by the fact that given the kinds of bonds or forces which hold it together, it's maximal. I'm maximal in that sense. If I put the chalk in my mouth, I'm still maximal. If I absorb the chalk into my, whatever you do with calcium, assuming this is calcium, then I become slightly bigger. But then I'm still one object. The chalk has disappeared. Now, I am similarly two Fiat object parts. The plane going through my center of gravity divides me into two Fiat object parts. Now, we could slice me in half through that plane, but then we create two objects. Fiat object parts are always connected to other Fiat object parts. In fact, this is how we define connectedness. Connectedness is always through a Fiat plane for material entities. This table is an object, and it's held together by screws or glue. If we pull it apart, we create two objects. The base, which is metal, and the top, which is probably wood. And then we have object aggregates. Now, these two pieces of chalk form one object aggregate. So these are examples of Fiat object parts. That's the Hüferschwanzel. And that's the Riedhüfer. And that's the Geschnattes Schwanzel. This is an object aggregate of three apples. Now, it's the exact sum of a plurality of objects. The core of this apple is a part of the mereological sum of these three apples, but it's not a member of this aggregate. So object aggregates have members where the objects have parts. The object aggregate can change its members over time. So there is something called IAOA, which is the International Association for Ontology and its applications. This has members. The association can gain some members and lose some members. I think that associations like that are object aggregates with some extra structure, in virtue of which the object aggregate can survive through time, even though it gains members and loses members. And examples of object aggregates in that sense are not just associations, but also populations, families, tribes, planetary systems. The object aggregate, which consists of all the items in a given automobile part warehouse. That's an object aggregate. And we even have a list of all the members. And this is part of the populations and collections ontology. Say again? Populations and communities, yeah. And this is a definition of member part of. I guess this would be a good time to break. I think we have a coffee break now. And so we meet again at 11 o'clock. So we got to the point where we were talking about objects, Fiat object parts, and object aggregates. Now, I explained that all of these are subtypes of BFO material entity, but they're not designed to be exhaustive. So there could be other subtypes. BFO does not restrict. It puts forward a proposal to serve as a common basis, but if people need more terms, which would be siblings of these, for instance, a Fiat object part aggregate, so the collection of all bones in your body might be an example, or the collection of all muscles in your body might be an example, then they can define such a term, and they can even propose that it be added to BFO if there is a general need. If you go to the BFO site, you'll find some literature. There is a paper in there which is on the classification of material entities. And there we provide much more detail about these three subkinds of material entities: organisms, portions of matter which are solid, the piece of chalk, for instance, and engineered artifacts such as tennis balls or laptops. So these are the three major categories of object, and they're all characterized by the fact that there are certain forces or bonds which hold the object together, and that an object is maximal relative to those forces or bonds. Not all material entities are objects or Fiat object parts or material entities, because, for instance, we might have the water in a glass, which is a material entity which falls under none of those three kinds. Another feature of BFO 2.0 is the distinction between more general qualities, such as temperature, and more determinate qualities, such as 37 degrees Celsius temperature. 37 degrees Celsius temperature is a subtype of temperature. What that means is that every instance of 37 degrees Celsius temperature is an instance of temperature. So John's temperature instantiates at a certain time this subtype of the more general type temperature, but at other times it instantiates other subtypes. And so John's temperature cycles through different subtypes of the supertype temperature. And notice that there are no sharp boundaries between these subtypes. They form a continuum. So we represent them as if they have sharp boundaries, but that's an artifact of the way in which we capture measurement data. Another addition in BFO 2.0 is the addition of the universal history. The history of a material entity is the sum of all the processes taking place in the spatial region occupied by that entity. So basically, the history of an organism is the organism's life, which is defined precisely in this way. And there is a one-to-one correspondence between material entities and histories. So every history has a material entity. Every material entity has a history. Your youth is a part of your life. So your youth is a temporal part of the history of you. So I just said all of that. Histories are additive. Thus, for any two material entities, A and B, the history of the sum of A and B is the sum of their histories. So the history of you is nearly the sum of the histories of all your molecules. And it's also nearly the sum of the history of all your cells. Now, disease. I'm going to spend most of the rest of the tutorial talking about things like diseases. So just as John has a temperature which cycles through different values, so John's coronary heart disease starts differently from the way it resolves itself into some stable chronic angina. So we start with early lesions and small fibrous plaques. It may even not be such that anyone is aware that John has coronary heart disease here, but then gradually it moves. Silent infarction, surface disruption of plaque, and then unstable angina, and then resolution into stable angina. And there's a lot of treatment activity along the way. So this one thing, John's coronary heart disease, instantiates all of these subtypes of the supertype coronary heart disease at different points during the course of John's disease. The course of John's disease is a process, basically a process of getting worse and then stabilizing. And again, we're dealing here with threshold divisions which we mark through language, but the actual changes themselves are continuous. There are no sharp divides represented by these divisions. So this is how we represent temperature. John is an organism. John's temperature is an instance of temperature. These are the universals, and these are the instances. And there is the course of John's temperature changes, so the life of John's temperature, if you like, through time, which is dependent upon John's temperature, which is a quality of John, the organism. And similarly, John's life is dependent upon John and on John's temperature and on all the other qualities of John which are involved in the course of his life, which is a process which is an occurrent in BFO terms. Now, we talked earlier about dispositions, the disposition of a glass to break or of a human to eat. And we said that if a disposition ceases to exist, then its bearer is physically changed. Just a warning now, diseases, all diseases, trivially, are dispositions. Now, the reason why that must be so is because two people can have the very same disease. Two identical twins may have the very same disease, but one realizes the disease in a way which involves many symptoms, and the other realizes the disease in a way which involves hardly any symptoms, because the one has treatment and the other doesn't have treatment. And that means the disease is there even if it's not expressing itself, even if it's not being realized in the form of the symptoms which are normally associated with that disease and which in many cases go to define that disease because of treatment. So the disease is not the course of symptoms, it's the disposition to have a course of symptoms, and that disposition may be blocked, or you may just be lucky. And then we have functions. The function of the liver is to store glycogen. The function of the birth canal is to enable transport. The function of the eye is to see. All those functions are dispositions, and they all too may be blocked by another disposition, namely a disease. So dispositions can block each other. Dispositions can be mutually dependent upon each other. So my disposition to experience a certain symptom because I have a certain disease may be blocked by a certain treatment. So the function of John's eye is to see, and the realization of this function is a process which is John seeing. Every disease rests upon some disorder in the organism. So some deviation from order. And that deviation is a bodily feature. It's some part of the body which is deviating from the canonical, as we referred to it earlier in the day. So there is a tiny molecular disturbance in John's liver. It's so tiny that he doesn't notice, the doctor doesn't notice. No one could notice because no one would think to look there because the disturbance is tiny. But there's still a physical disorder. And this is a part of the extended organism. The extended organism is defined as the organism plus all the things inside it. Bacteria and so forth, shrapnel, false teeth, pins in your leg, and so it's a causally linked combination of physically components that is clinically abnormal. That's what we mean by disorder. something. It might be a bodily part, it might be a quality, it might be a process of coughing or sneezing or collapsing, is clinically abnormal if it's not part of the life plan for an organism of the relevant type. That's the first criterion. So losing milk teeth is normal because that's part of your life plan. Acquiring additional teeth is abnormal. That would be very worrying. Secondly, something is clinically abnormal if it's causally linked to an elevated risk of something bad. So feeling pain, feeling ill, feeling exhausted, dying, not being able to walk, not being able to sit. So again, something is clinically abnormal if it's causally linked to something bad like that. And then thirdly, something is clinically abnormal if it exceeds a certain threshold level. And roughly speaking, by the threshold level, we mean the level which makes you want to go to see a doctor. Anatomists talk about the Bauplan, the building plan of the organism, which is built into the structural genes for an organism of that type. Now, there is also the life plan, which is built into the development and growth genes for an organism of that type. And for each organism, there is a certain universal sequence of events which will be typical or normal or canonical for organisms of that type at a relevant age. Let's suppose you have a genetic disease, so that at the age of 13 you're going to get a certain disease manifesting itself. Then that's not part of a life plan for an organism of that type. You are unlucky. You have a different life plan which deviates from a life plan, and that's true of all genetic diseases. But let me explain that these three criteria have to be simultaneously satisfied for something to be clinically abnormal. So you need to have all three of these things. That's why we talk about genetic diseases. Genetic diseases are diseases which people have because they don't share the genes that everyone else has. And we probably have to have two life plans, one for males, one for females. And we know, roughly speaking, what it is. We know that there's puberty, and we know that there's menarche and menopause and so forth, and death. I mean, death is universal. And then some people deviate from that life plan because they fall under a truck at an early age, or because they have some kind of delayed puberty, or because they are prematurely aging. And we recognize those things as diseases.
So would you be willing to consider a connection between the type function and this notion of a life plan? So the life plan is something like the realization of the comprehensive function? I see some similarities.
Yeah, one axiom that I have still not found a reason to challenge is the axiom that organisms do not have functions. Now, there could be artifactual organisms which have functions. You might cultivate a bacteria in order to eat oil spills or something, and then the function of that bacteria is to eat oil spills. But naturally occurring bacteria don't have functions. We might put them to use. Similarly, we might put our friends to use in cleaning our luggage, but then it's not their function to clean our luggage. They're organisms. The function of the heart, on the other hand, is to pump blood. So it's parts of organisms which have functions, or it's artifacts. And if you have an artifactual organism, then that artifactual organism would have a function. But you and I are not artifactual organisms. Or I'm not, anyway. The large part of the story of the life plan for an organism of any type is going to be the life plan for the organs and other parts, which is going to be involving functions. So the function of grasping is going to be part of your life plan. If you use your elbows to grasp, then that's not part of the life plan. And this is the big picture. So you start off healthy. Tiny molecular disturbance, gradually getting worse. Each day you perform a self-assessment. You ask your body, anything wrong? Body comes back, no, everything's fine. That happens every day. And then suddenly one day you do that and you wake up with a pain. And you are aware that there's something wrong. And you keep on self-assessing, pain gets worse. and then eventually you go to the doctor. So here you have a preclinical manifestation, just a pain. Here you have a clinical manifestation. This is a pain which needs to be checked. And so now you have here you have a disorder, here you have a disorder with a symptom. And you have a representation of the symptom by the doctor who requests that who performs a physical exam. And so now he feels your stomach and determines that there is indeed something wrong. So now he has a sign, a physical sign of the disorder. A symptom is something internal that you feel. A sign is something external that the doctor can feel and measure, or you can feel and measure. And so the doctor takes a specimen, sends it to a lab, gets a lab finding, and gradually the doctor builds up a clinical picture of what's wrong with you, which leads through an interpretive process to a diagnosis. And this may involve several cycles through different lab tests. And that diagnosis then leads to a treatment plan. So you treat your disorder, and that changes the symptoms, maybe makes them worse. So you keep going round and round in circles until finally you find a treatment plan which cures you. And that's it. That's what we deal with in Organism, which is the Ontology for general medical science. And now we have some more definitions. So a pathological process is a bodily process that is a manifestation of a disorder and is clinically abnormal. And a disease is a disposition to undergo pathological processes that exists in an organism because of one or more disorders in that organism. And now we can look how it works for a specific disease. So liver cirrhosis. And if you look back at the big picture, so we have, this is the etiology. You're healthy and something causes the disorder. And then you have the disease course, which is going to be affected by treatment, and which is going to be followed to a certain degree by the doctor. And then you have the therapeutic response, which follows the creation of a treatment plan. And then in the case of cirrhosis, the etiological process is hepatic cell death, which produces a disorder which is the necrotic liver, the changed liver, which is a part of your body. It's a material entity. And this liver bears a disposition, which is the disease called cirrhosis. And this disease is realized in a pathological process of abnormal tissue repair and hypoxia-induced cell death. And this produces abnormal bodily features in the form of signs such as fatigue and anorexia, symptoms such as fatigue and anorexia, and signs of jaundice and an enlarged spleen. The signs can be seen by both the doctor and or the patient. The symptoms can only be experienced by the patient. And then influenza is an infectious disease. So here the etiological process is an influenza virus getting into your airway and infecting your epithelial cells. This produces a disorder which is viable cells with the influenza virus on their surface. And the disposition which is born by this disorder is flu, the disease, which is realized in processes of acute inflammation, which produces symptoms of weakness and dizziness and signs of fever.
Is this also meant to capture psychological diseases?
So this theory of disease applies to all diseases, and we can talk about psychological diseases in exactly the same way.
So
It's just that we know a lot less, typically. But you're talking about psychiatric diseases, mental disorders, as they call them. So the underlying idea behind Organism is that all diseases, like all dispositions, have a physical base. So some people say if you have a liver cancer, then you have a carcinomatous liver, so you have a diseased liver, so the liver is the bearer of your disease. Other people say that you have liver cancer because your liver is carcinomatous. Both of those ways of speaking are, I think, perfectly in order. So there's the narrow sense of what is the bearer of the disease, namely the liver, or here the epithelial cells, the airway epithelial cells. And then there's the wider sense in which the bearer of the cancer or of the flu is the whole organism. And just to go back to schizophrenia, I think in the case of schizophrenia, it would be more difficult to use the narrow sense, but that's primarily because we don't know what precisely is the disorder which is the bearer of the disposition, which is the disease, which we call schizophrenia. And that's the characteristic difference between mental diseases and physical diseases. We know a lot more about physical diseases than we do about mental diseases, so far. Diseases are dispositions, but not all dispositions are diseases. So the disposition to go bald is not a disease, unless you're female, maybe. But then there are dispositions which we call predispositions, or risk factors, which are dispositions to diseases, which means that they are dispositions to dispositions. A predisposition is a disposition in an organism that constitutes an increased risk of the organism subsequently developing some disease. So it's a disposition to a disposition. And an example would be Huntington's disease. This is a surefire disposition. In other words, if you have it, then you always get the disease. And here the etiological process is a certain genetic inheritance which produces a disorder which is chromosome number 4 has abnormal MHTT. This bears a disposition which we call Huntington's disease, which is realized in pathological processes, which is accumulation of these protein fragments, which goes hand in hand with abnormal transcription regulation and neuronal cell death in striatum, which produces abnormal bodily features such as anxiety, disposition, and eventually difficulties in speaking and swallowing. Then HNPCC is a genetic predisposition which is not surefire. In other words, you can have it without ever getting the ultimate disease. And here we have a two-stage process. So the etiology is a certain inheritance of a mutant gene which produces, again, a chromosomal abnormality which bears the disease called Lynch syndrome, which is realized in a pathological process of abnormal repair of DNA mismatches, which produces a disorder which is mutations in these things, which bears the disposition, which is colon cancer. That is a predisposition to getting colon cancer. This is the definition of disease which you already saw. The definition of disease course is the aggregate of processes in which a disease disposition is realized. Someone who has a disease and gets a special kind of treatment will have a different disease course from somebody who has the disease without the treatment. And then we need to classify the different disease courses according to the different treatments which are available for a given disease. And then the picture looks like this. So John has a disordered heart, which is a disorder. John, as a result, has a certain disposition, which is his coronary heart disease, which depends upon the heart for its existence. And in virtue of this disposition, which gets realized, he has a course of disease, which is the sum of processes realizing his disposition. Organism is the ontology for general medical science. It defines all of the terms that we've been using here, including all of the terms on that picture. And we've done influenza. Notice that we also need to deal, when dealing with the disease course, not just in the bad things that happen and are painful, but also, or harmful in some way, but also in the good things which happen, which are painful. So when you have influenza, your immune system will give rise to a physiological response, which is actually most of the harmful experience that you have when you have flu. It's not the flu, it's your body curing the flu. And so Organism has an account not just of clinically abnormal processes, but also of clinically normal processes, which are the body's normal response to the clinically abnormal dispositions which the body acquired. All right, so that's immune response, that's Huntington's disease. That's cirrhosis. This is systemic arterial hypertension, which is just elevated blood pressure, but elevated blood pressure caused not by the fact that you are under stress, but by the fact that there's something wrong with your bodily system. This is diabetes. Hypersensitivity to penicillin, so this would be an allergy case. Early onset Alzheimer's disease. Stroke. Here we have three disorders and 3 dispositions. So we get an aneurysm in an artery. This gives rise to a disposition. The artery is weakened, and so it is likely to disrupt. Then it ruptures, and this gives rise to another disorder, which is all that blood in your brain. That creates a disposition of increased intracranial pressure, which gives rise to a pathological process of compression of brain structures, which produces a new disorder of cerebral ischemia, and again, neurons dying, which gives rise to a disease called stroke. And that's realized in symptoms of paralysis, loss of sensation, and so forth. All right, so that's it. Thank you all very much.